Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. We've got some interesting developments to unpack today.
Yeah.
It's about the situation in Ukraine.
That's right. There was that recent phone call, wasn't there, between Russian President Putin and U.S. President Trump.
Exactly. And it's really sparked a lot of talk, a lot of commentary about, where things might be headed.
Mm-hmm.
From what we're seeing, it looks like there may be two key ways U.S. President Trump might approach this going forward.
Yeah.
And that's really what we want to dig into today.
Okay. So following that call on Monday, some observers are suggesting that, well, the chances for successful negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, they might be fading.
Fading. Okay.
Yeah. The sense is that U.S. President Trump could be sort of preparing to step back.
Step back from actively trying to broker a deal, you mean?
From actively trying to find a diplomatic solution, yeah. That seems to be the interpretation in some corners.
Okay, so if that active diplomacy is potentially, being put on the back burner, what are the main options people see for U.S. President Trump? What's the thinking?
Well, one possibility that gets mentioned is that he might just accept Russia's demands.
Really? Is that seen as likely?
Honestly, no. Most analysts think that's pretty unlikely.
Okay.
A more talked about option is that U.S. President Trump will significantly cut back, maybe even stop, active support for Ukraine.
Right. That seems to be the path many expect him to take.
That's the direction a lot of the commentary points towards, yes.
Wow.
And then there's the third option,
which is
just continuing the level of support we saw under the previous U.S. administration.
But U.S. President Trump apparently sees that as what? Yeah. Unsustainable?
Reportedly, yes.
Yeah.
Viewed as unsustainable or perhaps just not desirable for his administration.
Okay, that really sets the stage. So if diplomacy is less likely, U.S. support might drop.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean for the actual conflict on the ground?
Well, the dominant view in some of the analyses we've looked at is that this thing gets decided on the battlefield.
Not through talks.
Not through talks. And there's a strong suggestion, a strong current of thought that Russia is likely to win in that scenario.
Win on the battlefield, especially if external support for Ukraine dries up.
Precisely. Particularly if there's a big drop in U.S. aid that's seen as potentially decisive.
So where does that leave Europe in all this? They've been involved, obviously, but what are the limitations people are pointing out?
Europe has definitely been active, trying to help Ukraine since the start, no question.
Yeah.
But a recurring point is that European nations are seen as lacking. Well, the sheer amount of weaponry needed.
Like they just don't have enough stuff.
Enough stuff, and maybe not the right kind of advanced systems, air defense, long-range artillery, things like that. Enough to really compensate if the U.S. steps back significantly. And some argue that even when the U.S. and Europe were working together closely under the last administration, Ukraine was still seen as being at a disadvantage militarily.
So even combined support wasn't quite enough to turn the tide definitively?
That's the argument some make, yes.
Okay, so given that potential drop in USAs and the limits on what Europe can do, what's the overall prognosis for Ukraine according to these analyses?
It's pretty bleak, frankly. The assessment from some quarters is that if the U.S. really pulls back support, Ukraine's situation is basically beyond saving by Europe alone.
Beyond saving? That sounds incredibly stark.
It is. The word ludicrous was even used in one analysis, thinking Europe could fill the gap. The perspective shared is that Ukraine is likely, well, the term used is doomed, regardless of the level of outside help.
Wow. Doomed. That's quite a perspective.
It certainly is. A very grim outlook presented in some analyses.
Which brings us back to peace talks, I suppose. If the military situation looks that bad, why aren't talks happening? What are the roadblocks?
Well, the key one, the one that comes up again and again, is territory.
Territorial compromises.
Exactly. Ukraine's apparent unwillingness to even consider making territorial concessions.
And Russia's not going to give back land it's already taken.
The regions Russia has incorporated, including Crimea. Yeah, the analysis is they won't be giving back without a major fight, likely a Russian victory on the battlefield first.
So that's a fundamental deadlock. And what about the fighting itself? Is the expectation that the lines will hold where they are now?
No, actually. There's a viewpoint that the Russian military advance Well, that it can't really be stopped.
Can't be stopped.
That's the view. And if the conflict just keeps grinding on like this, the suggestion is Ukraine could lose even more ground.
Like which areas?
Major cities are mentioned, Kharkiv, maybe even Odessa down the line. It paints a picture of continued Russian gains if things don't change dramatically.
So with that military picture and the deadlock on territory, Ukraine's position at any potential negotiating table must be seen as pretty weak.
Very weak, yes. That's the general assessment. Its whole defense, its whole stance really hinges heavily on that Western support continuing. Without it, the leverage just isn't there.
Right. Now, you mentioned the U.S. might be pulling back.
Yeah.
Part of that calculation must be about wider U.S. interests, right? It's not just Ukraine.
Absolutely. The U.S. relationship with Russia is complex, and it plays out globally.
Where else are they focusing?
Well, there are the ongoing complexities in the Middle East, of course, but probably even more significant is the Indo-Pacific region.
Meaning China.
China is viewed as a much, much more critical player for the U.S. partner, rival, whatever, compared to the situation in Europe. The strategic focus is shifting.
And are there economic drivers here too, beyond the big strategic picture?
Yes, economics are definitely seen as playing a part in the U.S. approach.
Like what? Domestic pressure?
Domestic economic pressures, yeah. And also the pursuit of potential economic advantages. There's even mention of possible deals related to Ukrainian resources influencing policy.
Interesting. Resources. And this ties into that bigger global economic shift.
It does. The center of economic gravity and political power, too, is moving towards Asia. It's undeniable.
There are projections about that, right?
Clear projections. By 2030, Asia's share of global GDP is expected to dwarf Europe's.
So the U.S. is naturally going to prioritize where the future economic action is.
That shift absolutely influences U.S. global priorities, including how it views commitments in Europe versus Asia.
So let's try and bring this all together. What's the sort of endgame view being suggested here regarding the actual territory from the perspective of U.S. President Trump's administration?
Well, there's a suggestion out there, maybe more than a suggestion, that U.S. President Trump might have already accepted it.
Accepted what?
Accepted that the conflict will probably end with Russia keeping control of the territories it currently occupies.
Including Crimea?
Including Crimea. It's seen as maybe an inevitable outcome in their view.
So not officially recognizing it?
No, not officially prisoned or recognized. But there's a perception that the U.S., under U.S. President Trump, understands this is the likely reality on the ground.
Okay. Well, the information we've gone through today certainly paints a complex picture, a potentially really pivotal moment in this conflict.
It does seem that way. The analysis suggests this recent call between Russian President Putin and U.S. President Trump could signal some pretty significant shifts.
Yeah, shifts in the whole approach to resolving this.
Yeah.
The potential implications, I mean, for Ukraine, obviously, but also for the wider geopolitical landscape, they seem quite considerable.
Very considerable indeed. Lots to watch.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.